One of the more common misunderstandings when it comes to the Christian thing is that a lot of us are under the misconception that we're called to never judge other people, right? And so, certainly when it comes to the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 5, you hear this particular line: do not judge, such that you yourself might not be judged. But if you go on and read that same passage, what the Lord goes on to say is, the measure you give will be the measure you get back. And on top of that, in the Gospel of John, chapter 7, what he says is, don't judge based on appearances, but instead judge with right judgments. So in that effect, if you pull all these different statements together, is that the Lord is not simply telling us to avoid judging other people, but instead it's an invitation to avoid rash judgments. And so the whole idea here is that you can't read people's minds. You can't get in people's heads. And so therefore, don't presume ill will. Don't presume negative intention. And on top of that, and kind of more to the point, you need to actively resist the temptation to dismiss and condemn other people. But instead, you're called to correspond to the invitation to truly help each other, to truly love each other, to do whatever you can to help each other pull away from the darkness and back into the light. Now, obviously, when it comes to this particular topic of fraternal correction, if you will, when it comes to having difficult conversations to help other people come back to the light, the gospel is very instructive and very thorough in terms of giving very practical advice. But to kind of keep things simple, perhaps we might focus on one particular passage from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 18, which gives us very specific and concrete advice as to what to do when someone wrongs us in some way. And so right at the bat, what the Lord basically says is that when it comes to a situation where, again, someone has wronged you in some way, instead of talking behind their backs or otherwise engaging in malicious gossip, we're called to speak to these people directly. Now, that said, when it comes to, again, having a direct conversation with someone who has wronged us in some way, make sure that you frame it properly in your own mind, right? So it doesn't imply that it's going to be an overt argument where there's yelling back and forth, right? So it doesn't have to be overtly confrontational. So the way I like to frame my own mind, to frame it in terms of sharing one's own experience. So maybe you say to the person, well, look, here's something which happened. And so when it comes to this particular situation, in terms of how I recall it, it would seem to be that this is what happened, or I feel like this is what happened, which perhaps was not right in some way. And then maybe you give the other person a chance to respond in turn, right? So it's a more civilized conversation about a perceived wrong which has been done, as opposed to an argument where your tempers are flaring back and forth. But another thing that comes to mind when it comes to speaking to people directly who, again, have wronged us in some way, it might not work, right? And you have to allow for that possibility. Like, it might work, but perhaps it might not work. But the idea is that you need to give people a chance. You need to give people an opportunity to make amends for the thing which has been done. And not simply because you're trying to act out of a general sense of Christian charity, but specifically because you're trying to do whatever you can to protect this person's reputation. And so therefore, again, as a starting point, don't talk behind their backs, don't engage in malicious gossip, but try your best to speak to them directly to resolve the particular issue at hand. Now, of course, in the gospel, the Lord takes it one step further, right? And so basically what he says is that after having spoken to the person directly, if that doesn't work, bring other people into the conversation. Now, the thing I want you to notice here is that this might sound kind of counterintuitive, right? And so it would seem to be that the proper Christian thing is to kind of bear these things by ourselves. But you got to realize that salvation is meant to come to us in the context of Christian community. And so when it comes to processing the experience, when it comes to bearing our woundedness, when it comes to correcting the other person who has wronged us in some way, we're not called to do these things alone, but we're called to do these things in community. Now, practically speaking, perhaps you might want to be kind of creative in this regard, right? And so in terms of who you bring to the conversation, perhaps you might want to bring someone who has a prior relationship with the person who has wronged you in some way, someone who has a certain kind of credibility in the eyes of this other person, right? And so the idea is that we're sharing in the responsibility and the burden of, again, bringing this person away from the darkness and into the light. Now, of course, in the context of the gospel, the Lord goes on to say that if the wrongdoer doesn't listen to these additional witnesses, if you will, take it to the church. Now, in the context of the early church, perhaps what was being contemplated when it came to this particular passage was this notion of bringing the matter to a bishop or a priest to have a more in-depth conversation with the wrongdoer and the aggrieved party. Now, that said, perhaps I might suggest that the general principle, though, to be observed is this idea of kind of clarifying what the church actually teaches with regards to the matter at hand. Now, in modern times, this might involve still a formal meeting, if you will, with, again, a bishop or a priest to talk about the matter at hand. But perhaps it might be something as simple as referring the wrongdoer to some credible source which clarifies, again, what the church teaches about a particular matter or issue. So, for example, some book written by a saint, or even something as simple as the Catechism of the Catholic Church. But that, of course, takes us to the final point that's raised in the gospel, right? And so, what the Lord basically says is that after having gone through these prior steps, if the wrongdoer still doesn't listen to even the church, maybe treat that person like a Gentile or a tax collector, which implies sort of a timeout, if you will. Now, when you hear this idea of a timeout or a certain kind of period of separation, it might sound kind of harsh, right? But what's being contemplated here is not so much a punitive thing simply, but in addition to that, something which is meant to be remedial. So the whole idea here is that when it comes to this point where you've tried a whole variety of different ways to kind of lead this person, again, away from the darkness and into the light, and those steps have failed, sometimes what you need to do is entrust the thing to the Lord, right? To kind of build in time and space for tempers to kind of cool down, for wounds to heal, and again, more to the point, to allow time and space for the Holy Spirit to work on this person's heart, right? And so even though there might not be overt conversations ongoing about the particular issue, the Holy Spirit is working on this person's hearts, ideally to, again, help them realize the wrong which has been done. Okay, now obviously there's kind of a lot going on here, but perhaps I might leave with one kind of final point, right? And so let's see it go through all these different steps, right? And it comes to this whole thing of, treating the wrongdoer like a Gentile or a tax collector, again, implying a certain timeout or this kind of period of separation, if you will. The question is, what do you do then? Like, what are you justified in doing? And so perhaps you might think to yourself, well, look, if I'm in a situation, like, am I justified to simply give up on this person? And the short answer is no. And so a couple thoughts in this regard. First of all, this idea that a lot of times when we're inclined to give up on other people or, make up a resolution that I'm never going to talk to this person ever again, usually that particular thought is stemming from a place of self-protection as opposed to an objective sense of the impossibility of the situation. So we need to be kind of sensitive to that. But on top of that, you got to recognize this really famous quote by St. Ignatius, where he says basically, pray as if it all depended on God, work as if it depended all on us. And so just to kind of expand on that point, right? So first of all, to pray as if it all depended on God. And so certainly it does depend on the Lord, all things, right? Everything is mercy, everything is grace, but particularly when it comes to matters of salvation and redemption. And so practically speaking, what that means is that, again, we're called to pray. To pray in terms of entrusting the final outcome of a particular issue or matter to the Lord, but at the same time to pray for inspiration. And so maybe the thought process is like, Lord, look, I perceive in this particular situation a certain impasse, a certain possibility, at least right now, in terms of moving forward. But I trust that if you have some way that you want me to participate in terms of moving the situation forward, you will give me a new opportunity at the appropriate time, and along with that, inspiration in terms of the particular words and tone and whatnot, right? So even though it might seem impossible right now, pray to the Lord to make all things new and to inspire you, again, if he wants you to participate in terms of moving the situation along. But again, there's this corresponding invitation in the same quote to work as if it all depended on us, right? And so certainly the Lord alone remains the author of salvation, but in the meantime, we're called to bring it, to bring everything to the table, to not simply give up on other people simply because we tried something which perhaps didn't work 20 years ago, but instead to bring everything to the table, our energy, our dynamism, our creativity, our intelligence, to do whatever we can, to do whatever the Lord is calling us to do, to bring our neighbor again away from the darkness and back into the light. We're called to do whatever we can as part of a community of faith to help each other reach the fullness of salvation. And on top of that, truly each one of us is our neighbor's keeper. We're called to love our neighbor as ourselves. And may God bless you all.